Welcome in. I am Paige Mendonça, joined by College Football Playoff Committee Chair Hunter Yurachek. Hunter, thank you so much for being with us. First, how are you feeling right now? Bracket is set. I know you got a lot of interviews, but how are you feeling?
Paige, I'm doing great. I was just walking by one of the TV sets, and ESPN's starting to talk about some of the matchups moving forward, and I think that's where we need to be, talking about the matchups moving forward and the excitement of the college football playoff.
Yes, well, we will get to those matchups. I will ask you questions about that, but I do have to ask some other questions. Now, I do know it was reported that the committee was up till 2:30 in the morning debating Notre Dame, Alabama, Miami. Why was it ultimately Miami that got the nod in over Notre Dame?
Yeah, and it was a process that we went through, and the first process was just continue to have that separation between Alabama at 9 and Notre Dame at 10, and we felt like Alabama, based on being the number one seed in the SEC championship game, the strength of schedule that they had, already with probably the best win in the country at Georgia early in the season, regardless of their performance, which we acknowledge was not great in the SEC championship game. They deserve to remain at that 9 spot, and Notre Dame for the time being at 10. And then we looked at the BYU and how they performed in the Big 12 championship game, a second matchup with Texas Tech with a very similar result where BYU was dominated on both sides of the ball as they were about a month ago. And we moved Miami ahead of BYU. And then that put Miami and Notre Dame at 10 and 11, respectively. And then we started to compare Miami and Notre Dame. And you look at the resumes of those two teams, both 10-2 teams, had some common opponents that they won by roughly the same scores in those games, very similar from a statistical standpoint. And then, of course, you've got to go back to the September Labor Day matchup where Miami beat Notre Dame in that game by 3 points. And I think that was, in the mind of the committee, what moved Miami ahead of Notre Dame into that 10th spot.
Now, I have to ask, because of the BYU factor here, of course, the conversation around them playing in their conference championship game, Alabama playing in their conference championship game. I've heard you say the committee can use those games as a marker. It's not necessarily one way or the other. But what was so big on the Miami side of things, or excuse me, the BYU side of things, that you felt like that factored more in than the Alabama side of things? Just the overall resume?
Well, the overall resume and the fact that Alabama had already beaten Georgia once this year.
Yeah.
Both teams had an opportunity, Alabama at Georgia and BYU at Texas Tech early in the year. Alabama won that matchup over Georgia head-to-head in the regular season. BYU lost at Texas Tech in convincing fashion, and BYU lost on a neutral site field in convincing fashion on Saturday. So the biggest difference between those two conference championship games and how we compared those teams and kept Alabama where they were and moved BYU down 1 is that Alabama had beaten the team earlier in the year that they played in the conference championship game and lost to, and BYU had a second loss to that same team in Texas Tech.
I think one of the main questions, of course, with this Notre Dame-Miami conversation is why now? How come not earlier this week? What was the conversation around that maybe before the rankings we got before this, and how come it ended up being this result as of today?
Yes, as I've mentioned a few times, when we did our first ranking back in early November, Miami was a loser of 2 or 3 games, and they entered our poll at 18. They're the winners now of 4 consecutive games and have been playing much better and have been creeping up from 18 to 16, 16 to 14, and then finally to where they were this week, right there on the heels of BYU and Notre Dame. And so not until this week were they directly side by side where we could compare them. They always had a team or 2 or 3 in between them.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's talk about maybe teams that were on the bubble or campaigning for consideration that maybe weren't necessarily in the conversation with your committee. But I'm curious, was Texas and Vanderbilt at all part of the conversation yesterday, or was this a little bit more focused on the games at hand and the teams we've already discussed?
Sure. Texas and Vanderbilt were part of our conversation significantly last week, and I'll take Texas specifically in this instance. Texas was our highest ranked 3-loss team. They have losses on the road at Georgia, who's number 3, and Ohio State, who is number 2. They had 1 loss against a Florida team that ended up 4-8, which is why they were placed at 13. Vanderbilt, we have a lot of respect for the Vanderbilt team that is came in at 14, and they were 10-2 as well. Vanderbilt had some wins against teams that were previously ranked in their top 25, but they just did not have that signature win. And so Texas and Vanderbilt were both discussed and debated a week ago, not as much this weekend.
Now, I know you've done a lot of interviews about this, but what conversation was happening in that room that maybe people aren't even talking about? One that maybe surprised you that was brought up?
I don't know that anything surprised us. It just that it was, what we knew based on the results of the conference championship games that happened on Friday and Saturday, that whoever was the 11th ranked team was going to be left out of the playoff. And they were going to be more than a deserving team that was not going to make the playoff based on not being one of the 5 highest ranked conference champions and not being one of the 7 at-large teams. And so that's why the debate into the early morning hours and then again at sunrise to try to make sure that we did the best job to vet through those 3 teams. And we had 2 spots and 3 teams that were vying for those. And I think just the fact that how passionate people were for Alabama, how passionate people were on the committee for Miami, and how passionate they were for Notre Dame, it was really hard to come to a consensus in our room. And I think you've seen that. I've listened to some of the debates here the past couple hours, and I think what we were debating in our committee room was what everybody was debating across this country outside of our committee room.
Absolutely. Any thought, I do have to ask, any thought to Duke at all being in this consideration and ranking them? I know earlier in the week we saw rankings where it essentially set up for James Madison to be in, but curious if there was any conversation after their performance last night.
Did talk about Duke and the other conference champions, but where we arrived at, it was going to be very hard to put a 5-loss Duke team move them into our top 25, especially when you had a James Madison team that was already in our top 25 and won their conference championship game in convincing fashion.
One of the things that we've talked about a lot as we view these each week is the comparison between conferences. And I know this year they were trying to use metrics and add metrics into the discussion a little bit more. Strength of resume versus strength of schedule. Any discussion on where those metrics lie in terms of value and where you guys felt like they fit into the conversation?
Yeah, I think they fit in very heavily in the conversation, especially when you look at Alabama. Alabama's record strength and strength of schedule were in the high top 5 or 6 within the teams that are ranked in the top 12. It was the highest strength of schedule Alabama had of all the teams in the top 11. And so we leaned, again, I don't know that we put more weight on it than other things, but it was definitively something that we used, especially when we were debating Alabama, Miami, and Notre Dame, because Alabama had a significant strength of schedule compared relatively to Miami and Notre Dame both.
Now, we know the playoff obviously has expanded. It's changed in many ways. Is there, now I know we get to enjoy the playoff and I know we'll enjoy these games, but is there any thought to the way that this has played out this year, adjustments and changes in the future?
Well, that's not the role of the selection committee. The role of the selection committee is for us to rank the teams 1 through 25. And from that, we set the playoff bracket based on the 5 highest ranked conference champions and the 7 at-large bids. Now, from my personal professional perspective, obviously, if we had an expanded field or conferences chose their conference championship participants differently, that could have made the job for the committee a little bit easier. But right now, what we're able to do as a selection committee is rank the teams 1 through 25, evaluate the championship games based on how the conferences do their tiebreakers and what teams they put into their championship games, and then to list our final rankings as we did this morning.
And one of the things that I personally would love to see is maybe some play-in games, because I feel like the head-to-head conversation, we know that week 1 head-to-head that we've talked about a lot has factored into this, but I feel like maybe closer to would be something that we could look at. Like you said, the committee's not in charge of that, but I think it could be something. We talked to Coach Joey McGuire earlier of Texas Tech, and he said, hey, if we had the debate between Notre Dame and Miami, maybe they play this weekend and we get to see that. What do you think of that?
Well, and I'll tell you, this is not from Hunter Yurachek, chair of the CFP selection committee. This is Hunter Yurachek, college football fan. just think about if we had a playoff that included Notre Dame and Texas and Vanderbilt and Utah and BYU. How spectacular that playoff would be.
Yes.
And, so I look at some of those teams that are incredibly deserving. There's so much parity in college football right now. The talent is getting spread throughout teams in the top 20. And it's hard to compare these teams with the super conferences that you have, the variance in conference schedules from one conference to another. Sometimes you get a better draw from one year to the next. And so it's becoming more and more challenging to evaluate these teams because of the parity that does exist in college football.
Well, and then you also have Notre Dame, who, of course, independent. That conversation certainly would change if they did have to play a game. So maybe we get that in the future. But as the committee member, what was the hardest sort of thing for you in terms of all of this in evaluating?
Again, Paige, it's really, every team is really, really good. And there's some statistical things. I think if you just talk about Alabama or Miami or Notre Dame, those teams, there's some things you can draw that are really positive for all of those teams. And you can, if you want to spin it for one team or the other, there's some things that you can definitively draw. And so really it was getting our 12 members to get us, we're never on the same page because we all have an individual vote, but at some point in time, we have to get to somewhat of a consensus so that we can rank these teams. And so, again, it was a endless debate on the merits of Alabama versus Notre Dame versus Miami that went into the early morning hours. And again, early this morning when we woke back up, and that was probably the hardest thing over the last 6 weeks to try to get to a consensus this morning because we knew as a committee how it was going to impact one of those three teams.
All right. Well, I'm going to ask you one last question as a fan. Okay.
Go ahead.
Out of the first round matchups, which one are you most looking forward to?
Oh gosh, I think the Texas A&M Miami matchup is going to be really, really good. I think two really good football teams. Miami's going to go to a really tough place to play in College Station with 105,000 plus people there. I think that's going to be a great matchup. And then you've got that rematch of Oklahoma and Alabama at Oklahoma. That was a classic back in October between those two teams, and it'll be interesting to see how that game plays out as well.
Well, Hunter, we appreciate you taking the time. Maybe now you get to rest a little and then enjoy the games as they go on, but we appreciate you spending time with us today.
Paige, thank you very much. Have a great Sunday afternoon.